Welcome to Varn blog, and we're having technical difficulties. Okay, all streams are now live. And today I'm with PH Higgins of Radical Thoughts, and maybe one day Former People, and You Were Right Replacement on Pop the Left, which I officially return to tonight after we're done with this interview. Although I'm not sure it's tonight, it may air tomorrow, but yeah. So we'll see. And today we're going to talk about the legacy of Terrorism and Autonomia and the debates between Mario Tronti and Antonio Negri. And, you know, the forgotten better parts of Italian communism in general, I think. I mean, like, there's been for years, I thought there was not enough focus on Bordiga and early Italian communism. And now I think we're like, and I know that Negri's popularity in the late 90s, early aughts is probably why there was so much of a focus on Autonomia for a while. But now it's almost like that didn't happen. So let's talk about it. First, for people who are complete noobs to the world of post-Tagliotti Italian communism, what is Terrorism and Autonomia?
All right, so Terrorism and Autonomia are... Autonomia is a movement that comes kind of after Terrorism proper, depends on wibbly-wobbly terminology and periodizations, but basically in the Italian situation after World War II, Italy sees a bit of a political crisis because workers have a very strong involvement with the Communist Party in the resistance. And parts of North Italy even have kind of periods of factory seizure and stuff because capitalists and fascist collaborators are fleeing as the U.S. Army is advancing, liberation is happening. And so after World War II, the Communist Party is very, very popular, but it kind of knows that it can't quite take power in a revolutionary sense because it's like, well, the U.S. is here, and they're really afraid of becoming ostracized and blocked out of parliamentary power. And also the infrastructure of Italy is absolutely destroyed, and it's already not that much of an industrialized country. It's like still heavily agrarian. There's still peasant bases all over, especially in the South. So the PCI takes up a heavy focus on kind of a pseudo populist kind of approach. And it becomes very involved in trying to have a parliamentary presence in Italian politics. And it also has a very strong involvement with the CGIL, which is one of the three major confederacies for unions. It's confederacy in the sense of like how the AFL-CIO is like the national, it's a national body for many different unions that all of different sectors that operate together. So this is kind of the situation. What's happening is, and then even though, so the PCI gets to have heavy involvement in parliament, it's trying to organize a wide spread of workers into enjoying the benefits of being a party member, but it also can't really seize power. And because of the necessities of trying to be in parliament and economic growth, the PCI has this awkward thing where they kind of frame themselves as like, the workers need to band together and make demands in order to spur economic development. Like, it is good that Italy be industrialized, that economic planning take place, so that the workers can get higher wages. But it's kind of, that's a pretty contradictory thing if you're claiming to be a communist party. And they're also caught in this thing where they have this awkward relationship to the USSR because they're pretty much USSR sympathetico, but Togliatti insists that Italy doesn't need the Leninist revolution. It can have the Italian road to communism, which is basically parliamentarian. So that's kind of the situation that's going on with the PCI. And then there's the PSI, which is the Socialist Party. And at this point, for the most part, it's subsidiary to the Communist Party. The leadership is trying to figure out, there's different factions in it. There's one guy who basically tries to Bolshevize the entire thing. There's other factions that want it to become like more, almost like leftcom Luxembourgist. There's other ones that want it to be more like a slightly more like, we're going to be the democratic, like social democratic party, except we're not the actual social democratic party, because that's another party. But in general, that's kind of what's going on. Apparismo is a reaction to, in the simplest terms, it's a reaction to this way that the PCI and to some degree the PSI have kind of had to buy into this argument for economic development. It's a reaction to what they see as like the Fordism of contemporary industrial society in Italy. And what they do is they say that they kind of take the position that the PCI and the CGIL, the main union, radical union, don't have a very good awareness of what is actually going on in the industrial sectors that they claim are necessary for the Italian economy. And they don't have an understanding of the actual workplace conditions and composition of the working class in contemporary society, especially as in the 60s, there was a big move of new workers out of the south of Italy, which is still, again, very agrarian, into the northern industrializing cities, which have places like Fiat, stuff like that. And and I think it's important to realize, again, like with the agrarian stuff, like in the 60s, you still have peasants in Italy. There are like social studies where they're going around and talking about like, and the peasantry in like South Italy, you can find studies where they're talking about like these peasants, if you ask them what their conception of like the national Italian state is, they go, oh, it steals from us. That's all it exists to do. Like they have no interest in Italian nationalism or anything like that. They're very regionalized, and they still, and it shouldn't be romanticized. Like if you read these studies, they also talk about like if a foreigner comes into like these peasant like territories, they consider it totally within their right to like exploit you. That is just like their God-given natural duty, is like they can just exploit foreigners who like enter into like their region and stuff. But these workers are moving into these cities, and they have no interest in the kind of development in the PCI to try and be like, we're going to like negotiate with the managers and stuff. They're just like, no, we're not, like, why would we do that? So they're much more hostile and directly involved. So that Apparismo originally, the kind of starting point comes from a guy called a loose collection of people mainly noted around this guy called Raniero Pensieri, who comes from the PSI. He's from the Socialist Party, actually. And basically, with the Hungarian crisis, the PCI and the PSI are kind of in a weird spot because, again, with the PCI, they kind of have plausible deniability because of the whole Italian road thing. So they're like, oh, we're kind of different. Like, we don't need to be like lumped in with that. But they also support the crushing of the Hungarian revolt in 1956. And then the PSI is kind of thrown into chaos because, again, there was one wing of it that the left wing of it was pushing for like really hard Bolshevization that was actually almost more ML and stuff. So Pensieri is interested in trying to figure out maybe the real question for him is, he's saying he has kind of two faces to his thought that are very important. One is that the workers have a particular kind of autonomy that is due to the fact that the workplace is the productive center through which value comes. Like, you know, they are, as workers, they invest labor power and they valorize, and the entire economic system of capitalism is built around that, and it's a point of contradiction. So the workers have, of course, an involvement in the workplace that is also contradictory in the sense that they come to know the workplace and have some awareness of it, but it's also not in their control. And then two, the other point that he makes is he sees a new kind of planning system that is integrated into capitalism as a whole because of Fordism after World War II and basically Keynesianism, which is kind of like, there's an implicit like, guys, maybe planning doesn't just equal socialism. So that's kind of where Apparismo starts. And Panzieri kind of falls out of the graces of the PSI, although he stays tied to it. And he starts a review or a journal called, I can't remember the Italian name, but it's called Red Notes or Red Notebooks. And that's where you get Negri also comes to PSI. I think he was actually in the Christian Democrats earlier. Yeah, you get Tronti. I think Alquati is in it. You get all these figures that are all pretty much asking the question of like, what are the actual workplace conditions going on in Fordist production in these heavily industrializing cities, and what do the workers actually think? Because it doesn't appear that the parties and the unions are really able to do that much to understand these conditions right now. And it should be noted that like the unions at this time, the communist unions, the way they operate is they have collective bargaining at a national level for each union. Quaderni Rossi, that's it. That's the Italian name of the journal, Red Notebooks. So, they don't have bargaining at the level of each factory or site. So the workers don't really get to be involved in confrontations in that way. So there's like a strong union, but it's not really something that's giving individual factory workers like at their local plants all that much power. And in fact, the Communist Party like fought against the idea of like localized things because they wanted it to be state. They wanted it to be at the level of like, because they thought it gave them more strength for basically parliamentary maneuvering to have it at the national level. And the thing about Apparismo is the first period that's proper Apparismo is probably like 1959, 1960. I can't remember exactly when Quaderni Rossi started. Let me pull up. I have a thing here. Okay, so 1961 about, and then it goes to about 1967 or 68, which is when you see kind of a break. Mario Tronti is one of the major figures. He writes a book in 1967 called Workers in Capital, which was released fairly recently, translated by David Broder. And that becomes pretty influential. But a lot of it is stuff that's already been read in Quaderni Rossi. And then in 1968, there's a journal that's like him, and it has Tony Negri. And that is called Contrapiano, which literally means counterplan. And this journal actually goes until 1973, but Negri leaves after the second issue. And this is around this time, Negri, who is from the Tronti, who is from the PCI, he's kind of been trying during his Apparismo years to be this kind of extra parliamentary antagonist to the PCI in the sense of pushing them to be more militant, pushing them to be more involved in the direct working process, listening to workers. And it should be noted that one of the major things with Apparismo was that these were intellectuals who basically thought we need to go into the factories and talk with people. Like they're very big on, workers. I can't remember what the term is for it, but like, producing workers' reports, like they call it co-research. So there, and what's interesting is they at least frame themselves as not trying to be telling the workers what to do. It's almost entirely supposed to be a like receiving thing. Like we're going to receive insight from the workers, then use that in turn to make like propagandistic materials that will like resonate with what they say they want to hear and like learn about and stuff.
Can I pause you for a second?
Oh, what?
I just want to ask you, like, we're going a lot, and I want to tease some stuff out.
It's very broad to like get into what these things are.
So I think one thing our listeners should really take a lesson from is the weird position that the PCI got itself into. One, Italy is kind of unique in that it had a long history of mercantile proto-capitalism and capitalism, but it also was way underdeveloped for Europe, way later than a lot of the rest of Europe. Two, the PCI maintained the old United Front Second International stance about engaging in elections but never forming unity governments with bourgeois parties.
They were also explicitly blocked from the 1948 election.
Right.
Like they were not allowed to be, I mean, constitutionally they could be in a government, but the government that actually got elected in 1948 was not having them involved. And that was an explicit move. You know, the US was involved in shoveling millions of dollars and making sure that the PCI had no place,
right.
Even though they had a sizable parliamentary force.
So, yeah, well, they had 20% of the parliament and 34% of the vote in 1947. However, what I find interesting is Togliatti's focusing on the parliamentary way. Like we can be Bolshevik, but we're going to go the electoral route for obvious, kind of obvious reasons. I find fascinating because it actually dovetails perfectly with what Adam Perowski would predict would happen in that bind, which is you have to push for national development to kind of build up your base and also to maintain a certain popularity with your workers. But it's also going to alienate a lot of the workers themselves because you're not leading to individual site-based reforms. And I also find it interesting, I didn't know this, that the PCI had maintained their national union bargaining because, national union bargaining and whatnot have begun under the fascist, actually. Until, so that, the whole, national union movement and national union bargaining is something that is consistent with certain interpretations of Bolshevik policy. It's not but it is a weird holdover from fascist Italy too.
Mm-hmm.
So that would put them in a particularly precarious position, right? If you see this, how unpopular they might actually be with elements of the working class because of that. And also, they're going to be strategically able to be the largest opposition party, but they're even if they have been allowed fair election under those circumstances, it's highly unlikely that they could have ever been able to achieve enough of a plurality to run a government.
Yeah.
So, and
one of the things that you see happen is actually they kind of start to realize that they'll never have enough. I mean, they do put forward plans and stuff, and occasionally they have some stuff that is actually sounds like it could have been a pretty good workers plan that had a lot of infrastructure building for public services and actually nationalize the electricity plants and stuff, but they kind of realize that they're never going to get anything through national. So what happens is a lot of their rhetoric and attempts to involve workers and stuff gets just pointed at USSR support, anti-nuclear weapons protests, anti-early NATO and the European common market. They start just protesting that, which, it basically just becomes we can show that we're a sizable communist party in the European, the West European states, and tie ourselves.
Were they larger than France?
I know that France and Italy are both the most prominent ones. I don't know the specific numbers of which was actually larger.
I don't know off the top of my head either. I'd actually wonder that, and then I would also like, are they a larger portion of the, because the population of France is probably larger than the population of Italy too. So there's a couple of factors I'd have to consider there. But I just to get into teasing out like the weird scenario. There's an interesting question here. I don't know this, but was part of this related to spheres of influence debates?
Could be. I am still honestly like the amount of research I've been doing on this. I've been doing notes mainly on revolutionary movements in Italy and Germany, and I literally went back and started with the First International, and then I like jumped ahead and started reading stuff on this for this discussion, and I still mainly got caught up in just reading about stuff up through like red notes in 1950 to 1960. So like it's been a very sizable research project that is still midway through, and international like global scale politics is just not something that I've gotten into yet all that much in terms of like definitively what this relationship to the USSR was, and as well as that. So I don't really know exactly how much that kind of stuff would be playing out. I mean, I can say definitively after World War II, at least through 1948, the U.S. has a sizable interest and presence in determining how Italy is going to be structured, and making sure that its parliament is not going to be dominated by communist parties.
Right. And it does also seem that some of the developmentalist stuff that mirrors perfectly in France, and that wasn't just because of the U.S. It's also because of pressures from Khrushchev, I guess, towards détente to have it all within a formally democratic sphere, even though I don't think they technically invoke anything like the Italian version of democratic socialism until the 1970s. But okay, back to Operaismo, which you were getting us into. So basically, this becomes a concern to deal more with bottom up stuff with the workers and taking workers' inputs, and which also just from a strategic, like even from a strategic electoral point, if you want to increase your popularity with us, with the workers, you have to deliver things they actually want beyond their national level representatives and the national unions or whatever. So that seems like a kind of natural development. Why was it so radicalizing? And how is it different? And also, like, what it seems to take a different stance towards internationalism than the PCI does too.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is like because, like many other movements at this time, the way that they frame the relationship of the worker as a fundamental contradiction in the workplace is like tied to this kind of greater like philosophical question about like revolutionary subjectivity. And it kind of, like once you start talking about the worker in the workplace as this like fundamental obstacle to capitalist production, it ties into this idea that like you need to kind of activate the working class like interventions and attacks on capital more directly. Now, I think that one thing that I should like put as a major like asterisk is Operaismo. I'm not someone who speaks Italian. Great tragedy for this conversation because I can only rely on English resources. One of the problems with studying stuff like Operaismo and Autonomia is it has developed a pretty sizable kind of mythology around it. And it's very hard to say that definitively like how much influence they actually had on like the 1968 events in Italy and even like the 70s and Hot Autumn, aside from like, yes, there were specific cells of like up to 100 people who proclaimed that they were part of Autonomia and were like maybe involved in like terrorist activity.
This is true for both the ICP and Italy too. The International Communist Party of Bordiga in the same time period, and I think its myth is even more recent.
Yeah.
But I also, if you look at like, I don't want to totally poop on Trotskyism, but American Trotskyism gets over focused on in the same way. Like it was a big movement, but it was never as big as the SPA or the CPUSA in the 40s and the 50s. Like,
Well, and I mean, there's more recently like people who claim. I think that the more honest way, because I actually like a lot of, especially the early Apparismo like theorists, and respect what they were trying to do, and I think that they actually do have a really good grasp on really clear problems. And I think that it's more honest to kind of just be like, this was a loose collection of research interests that hit on some real things and did have and did inspire like social movements in a real way. I think that they might have had more influence on things like the student movement and certain sections of feminism in Italy, but they did have an impact. And now there's kind of more of a tendency when people talk about being like an autonomous Marxist, they kind of say like, they say how there was like a loose configuration of these research interests that you can kind of locate a crux of, socialism or Barbary from France, which there was like an actual correspondence between them and like Italian people. And then some of those like Trotskyist figures, ex-Trotskyist kind of figures like CLR James and the Boggs.
So the Marxist humanist in the CLR James rooted on a Skaya tradition as opposed to like the Marxist humanism of like Khrushchev, right? Like, so, right. Yeah. So, but all these are, it's interesting to me because one of the things that I was fascinated when I started really studying Apparismo and Autonomia is like, it ends up marrying both a lot of Trotskyism and post-Trotskyist positions, vaguely flirts with some left-com positions, but there's already a left-com tradition pretty well established in Italy. So it's if you think about the need, like if you think about convergent evolutions, there's already something filling that role there.
Yeah.
So there is, but it does seem outsizely due on students. And then its relationship to the historical PCI and like, I don't know, the fact that these people were technically Stalinists and Marxist Leninists in the beginning is totally lost. Like, when you look up autonomia now or autonomous Marxism, you're like libertarian socialism. It's like Marxism with post-structural anarchist characteristics.
Yeah, that's definitely in part, I think, due to, Negri, Antonio Negri being kind of like the predominant guy that like popularized it and mythologized it with Michael Hart.
Right, particularly in English, yeah.
Particularly in English. And I mean, the thing is that to some degree it is like, it does, especially when it becomes not Apparismo but Autonomia, it does get this weird like, it has this weird like proto-communizer tendency to it, but it's also like, it's like France 68ers where it's like, we're quoting Lenin and Mao all the time. And I think that's true. It tends to be something that people get into initially thinking that, you get these descriptions where it's almost like autonomist Marxism is when you have like anarchist practice with Marxist theory or something.
You're like they're platformist or something, and they're not.
And it's like, yeah, and it's like if you read like Red Notebooks, their starting point is like Lenin. Like Lenin in 1917 is like everything that they try to frame around like their theory of revolutionary action. And going back to one of the points you made about why is it so like, why does it have a tendency towards militancy, is that this specifically with Mario Tronti, like his major intervention that he makes, which is a pretty brilliant one, like, even if you think that in the end he's wrong, I know Charlie Post has criticized this tendency, this idea a lot, but like Tronti takes volume 2 very seriously, volume 2 of Capital very seriously. And that's one of the kind of cool things about autonomy in general. It's like, oh, like they take volume 2 of all the volumes as like super essentially important.
As opposed to everybody's volume 1 fetish and
yeah.
the weirdos who focus, like me, who focus on volume 3, like their volume 2 fetish. Yeah, although I also think about the other tendency that used volume 2, and that was delusions.
Yeah.
So that is worrisome, but go ahead.
Well, Negri does get into like Deleuze Guattari thought. When he's in France, he literally co-writes a book with Guattari.
Well, Guattari, yeah. Go ahead.
Tronti takes volume 2, and one of the interesting things about volume 2 is volume 2 actually emphasizes even more, I think, than volume 1, the whole the centrality of the emergence of free labor and the development into wages because of that development. And Tronti basically says that the entire development of capitalism is labor develops in a certain way first and becomes an organized form first, and capital reacts. So like the decomposition through, enclosure and stuff like that produces free laborers that develop certain interests and become like a social mass that then property owners have to deal with. So property owners then start to collectively respond by instantiating the wage form slowly that develops through the instance of free wage labor being a thing first. And Tronti says this is the pattern that follows through capitalist development. And Negri holds with this to some extent too, where he says 1917, the development of Keynesianism and Fordism for Negri is 1917 is the thing that creates the idea of the working class as a political actor, definitively. Suddenly, even initially the bourgeoisie and the social capitalists, which is, and again, a volume 2 term, which just means the abstract interests of capitalists acting as capitalists, basically, is how
capital in the abstract as opposed to individual entrepreneurial whatever.
And basically, they say at first they think that their main enemy is just the USSR as this one national bloc, but then they realize, oh shit, because regardless of what the USSR is, it has 1917 instantiates, there is a working class everywhere. The working class has some sort of political interest now that has been expressed, and it is consolidated in a way. And the collective capitalist in each nation state has to respond and deal with that in a way that they haven't before. And they see Keynesianism as doing this.
Right. They see Keynesianism. They kind of also see MMT, Fordism. I get a lot of my periodizations of contemporary capitalism outside of classical capital, from weirdly actually people like Philip Morawski, who are not Marxist, and then from autonomy and Marxist humanists, because they give you reasons why Fordism exists in the social compact after Fordism exists, and then why neoliberalism develops as a response to that, both as a political and economic project. What it also does, unlike some people who focus on volume 3, is a lot of people who focus solely on volume 3 take the idea that capital is a revolutionary subject itself, whatever that, not even the capitalist class, just capital, and that the business cycle and the crisis cycle of the longer business cycle, right, is actually the only thing driving history, and removes working class agency from the picture almost entirely. And I think that happens concurrently in a bunch of different political theories. Arguably, Althusserianism heads in that direction too. Communization theory, and their belief of the impossibility of the working class to work this way also comes out of this. So there's a lot of different ways it can go. And you know, so this piece, so people know why we're talking about this so much, is like you're doing this research for a bunch of essays that we might be writing a book together on.
Hopefully, I've already, you know, expressed that I've almost bit off more than I can chew, which is a tendency with me. Like back when I was like, I'm going to write a book on the history of time, and then I was like, never got out of like ancient Mesopotamia accounting. I was like, oh, this is fascinating.
I one time said I was going to write an article of about every communist theory about why the workers, the prediction of the workers' movements of the 1890s didn't happen, and then I realized like this is 4 books, like just yeah.
Mason, it's a strong tradition we find ourselves in. Yeah,
right. My favorite is, you know, I thought, you know, I got from Hal Draper that Marx had originally wanted to do Capital in 6 volumes, right? Mm-hmm. Even going into the capitalist theory of fate, which I wish we had a full articulation of Marx's view of the capitalist theory of fate. Just saying, that's kind of an important lack. When he talks about the problems with state socialism, which Marx does talk about a lot during the First International. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Capital is what, like 3 volumes shorter than it's supposed to be, because he realized it was pretty much impossible to cover everything he wanted to cover.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are letters where he says that he abandons, like, you know, that full draft. But it's still shorter than it's supposed to be.
Right. It's after the completion of Volume 1, and he had to be forced to publish Volume 1 by Engels to make money, because he was, you know, for a variety of reasons. When I say it was Engels had to really talk him into it, because he wanted to wait till all 6 volumes were done to publish any of them. And, you know, it took 30 years to get what we got, and volumes 2 and 3 are unfinished. That's part of why they're dry. So let's get back, though. We're talking about what they're pulling, this interesting thing that Tronti is pulling. Like, Tronti's form of workerism has literally been the only form of workerism that I've ever found appealing. All the other forms of workerism have basically felt to me like, you know, cultural stuff, or like...
Yeah. Well, I think it should be, for people, you know, listening, like, operaismo in Italian is usually translated as workerism. Like like operisti is like workers. It doesn't have like the negative context exactly that it now has. Like, it's not, I mean, this is kind of one of the fascinating things, is that it has this weird division, because in some ways, like Mario Tronti in Workers and Capital, it is a little bit like overly centralized on the idea of like the factory worker, like literally the factory worker.
Right. It gets into the end notes problem of the over fetishization of the industrial worker as the image of the collective laborer or whatever.
Which is in part, but I mean, it's fascinating because it's about like the factory worker, but it's also specifically this idea of what is sometimes called class composition. So instead of like, they don't really have, I mean, they talk about like class consciousness, but really what they're interested in is class composition, because again, it's like capital reconfigures labor in contradictory and strange hierarchical ways to do it. So like, they actually are cognizant of like, it's not like everyone is out like there being the same factory worker on the assembly line. Like they say, there's this weird division between kind of the old labor aristocratic, like specialized workers who know how to run the factory. There's these skilled workers that are the product of the recomposition of labor under Fordism. And then there's also this idea of the social factory, which is because of Keynesian Fordist like planning and the attempt to position industrial development as antithesis to crises, that like society as a whole gets like structured around like the operation of productive development.
Right.
And
So
that's why you get this split, though, that is like kind of at the heart of what happens with Negri, which is it has obvious reasons to then say that like other social movements that aren't the proper workers are part of, you know, this cycle and struggle, right? Because they say everyone is involved in the development of society along the lines of the factory. You know, the people who do household labor and stuff are going out and purchasing goods and things to maintain the social reproduction of the workers for the factory. Goods are produced en masse along the social plan, so any attempt to disrupt it is like part of revolutionary activity.
Because you're disrupting social. I mean, like this is the beginnings of something like social reproduction theory. I mean, there's a reason why like a lot of feminists pick up on this,
and
but it's also solid. It is solid Volume 2 scholarship though, because Volume 2 is when I realized that Marx does not think that you just have to be a direct commodity producing laborer to be part of either the proletariat or the working class. That anyone dependent on the general wage fund that services the general reproduction of the circuit of capital is part of the working class, and that is made clear in Volume 2.
Yeah,
like that's not at all obvious in Volume 1.
And I think it's interesting to note that like Tronti in Workers in Capital, he's not really making this explicit. This is like, again, his book is influential because it's picked up by these other movements who then like start trying to apply it in these other ways. And with the like household labor thing, I think that the way that it kind of initially is read, even by oh gosh, I cannot remember her name, but like the women in the subversion of not Federici. There's the one before one? Her, like women in the subversion of community or something like that. But like her version of it, when she, and this is something that Harry Cleaver does too. He's like the more like modern.
Maria Rosa della Costa.
Della Costa, that's it. When they talk about like women being involved in the production of value and household labor, the initial reading, I think, is actually quite consistent with like Tronti and maybe consistent with Volume 2, which is that what they're saying, like, because like, again, one of the things that when Tronti is talking about like they're reacting to the workers, part of this is he also points out that, you know, value and wages is determined in part through like what the social expectation of the standard of living is, and like in general how much you need to pay to get labor to come and work for you. And like this relates when you read like the social reproduction circuit. It's like, you know, the centers that make consumptive goods have to receive enough value from the working class and from the bourgeoisie in wages and in surplus value to be like able to reproduce itself, and that has to then flow back into the productive sector and stuff. So Tronti makes this argument that like the reason that the fight for wages is super important is because it can kind of burst beyond proper like value relationships if you end up getting higher wages than is like, you know, actually profitable and productive for the capitalist sectors. And so part of the idea is that like social reproduction
contradictions, right?
Yeah, social reproduction from the standpoint of household labor is like household labor is a way of diminishing the amount of wage necessary for like the worker themselves, because there's this amount of like reproduction that is just kind of taken out of capitalist accounting. So like what the argument is just that you have to understand that the labor that goes into household work is a way of producing value, like from the perspective of the capitalist as a whole, it saves them value.
Right.
It's not that like they are producing work that is like accounted as value in the whole like economy per se, like in the sense of like valorization of commodities.
Or to put it in simpler classic Marxist terminology, it reduces socially necessary labor time. Like if you think about like household labor is unpaid labor that you don't have to account for, thus reducing in your accounting the social necessary labor time that goes into everything. It's still necessary. Someone's doing it. That's also like why I think there was a big push by capitalists to both create a market for, but also to offset the need for a lot of family labor by automation. That's like it creates it's a great market. It's a new market, right? To create a new commodity in where the initial profits are going to be super high, and as prices get drive down, they get lower. But also, it's also helping them by eventually enabling them to use women to lower their wage through wage competition and stuff like that. So like there is this way in which this social reproduction is super important across the board. And what I think is interesting about Tronti and also a lot of the Italian autonomist Marxist feminists is they realize this and actually articulate it, even though it's already kind of implicit in capital. I think I can make all these arguments with pure appeals to just categories in Capitals Volume 1 and 2.
I think it gets misapplied and misread because I partially just the term that because they still use the term productive labor, that gets confused with the idea that the argument is that this is valorizing for the immediate process of production of commodities and stuff. But a lot of this original stuff is not claiming that. It's actually quite insightful because it recognizes, and I think that recognizing that insight of this plays into how the amount of valorization that applies through the wage is socially constituted in part by class struggle over wages and by partitioning portions of labor that are unwaged, that plays a big role in how that is constituted for that's the main argument, which is actually quite insightful and quite useful. But it's I think that ironically, if you start making claims that it's all just productive labor in the valorizing sense, you actually lose what is strategically and tactically important about that insight to some extent. And I think it's terminologically just kind of a facet in part because of the term, they still use the term productive laborer, or reproductive labor or something like that. And I think this kind of leads into one of the general problems that this tendency encounters early on, because in 1968, 69, there's Mario Tronti, Negri, and a couple others are in Contropiana, which is Counterplan. And this at this point, Red Notebooks is also disbanded because Panzieri and Tronti. I don't know as much about the Red Notebooks split. I think it's mainly that there's a series of strikes and stuff, and I think Panzieri considers it sort of a dead end and a failure, and Tronti and others think that it's the start of something, and they kind of go their separate ways. And Raniero Panzieri dies in his 40s. He dies really young. So then they start, Tronti writes his book, which includes articles and new stuff, and they start Contrapiana. At this point, the main split that Negri leaves is because Tronti is still kind of trying to be the loyal opposition in the PCI. And he goes and he starts going into the PCI again. And I mean, Tronti is still a senator today in Italy. I think he's still a senator. He's still alive. They don't have the PCI anymore. They have something that's called the Democratic Party or something. And he kind of has this, within and against theory of you can have the institution, you can be in the institutions and intentionally have your position be one of calling for antagonism and fighting for the workers to revolt at the sites of involvement.
So Negri, it's the workers version of the Ackerman plan.
Yeah, sort of. And so Negri has this kind of, Negri still wants to try and see if the PCI can be involved in a more militant, antagonistic direction in relationship to the masses being studied and interacted with. Negri goes in a direction where he still is like, nope, extra parliamentarian all the way. We're not going to be involved in the institutions themselves because we need to fight the institutions. And this is kind of the split where Mario Tronti, in his retrospectives, basically says operaismo ends here.
Mm-hmm.
He does not care about really trying to claim operaismo exists past like 1967. And so if you want to like periodize this, you might want to call this autonomia instead, because Negri has a movement called like apariste autonomia, something like that, like workers' autonomy, basically. And Negri actually notes that the like Fordist period ends by the 70s. And what he says is that they've gone from a situation of like the planning state that attempts to replace or subdue crisis via development and Keynesian spending and Fordism into what he just calls the crisis state, where he kind of just says, well, capitalism is trying to just crush any attempt of mass like workers' development in general. They realized that with Fordism, Keynesianism, they built a mass body of workers that are all in specific areas, and with the crisis state, they just constantly intervene and change everything so that doesn't happen anymore.
Which to realize that in the 70s is highly insightful. I mean, because most people don't realize that until they study neoliberalism from the viewpoint of like the aughts. I mean, like, so they're aware of it as it is happening, and before neoliberalism starts really reconfiguring politically, even in like the U.S. under Carter, or at the end of the 70s Labor administration, Britain on through, until it gets put on hyperdrive on Thatcher. For them to see that in the 70s, in the early 70s, is highly insightful.
The less inspired, the part that has been mythologized, but I think is actually what lands them in particularly bad tactical decisions, is that Negri basically takes this. Negri continually, from this point on, emphasizes this idea that like it's all just about control from this point on. It's all about like the capitalist enterprise state. Like he literally uses it in like enterprise -state is just going to intervene at direct control of workers at all periods, at all times. And he basically says at this point, mass, development, like mass slow, like hegemonic development is off the table. So it's the intensity of the revolt that matters more than anything else. Like the intensity of struggle against stuff in the immediate moment supersedes any attempt at long-term, like, building, march through the institutions, building up anything. And he starts to sound really early on kind of like a communizer, because he talks a lot about like, seizure. Like at this point, because everything is like through a process of control, the most radical thing is when people go and seize stuff and they take it for themselves and for their self-valorization of their consumptive abilities, and they realize that they're revolutionary subjects. And he's like, it becomes very like, this kind of sketchy militancy, and it becomes less about, he basically abandons this earlier idea of like the worker at the point of production as something interior to capital, because like for Tronti, it's very, very important that you realize like, and this is where like the anti-work portion of it comes, because even Tronti talks about like the worker has to struggle against their own role as labor power.
Right.
Like that is a division in the like existence of being a worker that has to be struggled like against. And for Tronti, like that is why the workplace and like the productive centers are important. But for Negri, like it becomes this idea that seems a lot more like what you see where it's like these outsiders of capitalist society, you know, like there's going to be these groups of people that are no longer see themselves as part of capitalist society, that amass into like the subaltern movements, you know, these subalterns like social movements through the cracks and stuff.
I think we need to mention how much real subsumption, like, you know, which by the way is an analogy drawn off of a removed section of Capital Volume 1 applied to the entirety of society, starts getting Negri more and more into basically post-structural, like non-Marxist modes of thinking in response to neoliberalism. He does seem to be different than Foucault and even Deleuze, who kind of and Deleuze here specifically, not Deleuze and Guattari together, who seem to flirt with neoliberalism's deterritorializations and blah de blah to make it good. I mean, because like, you know, it's like when Deleuze right before, I mean, not Deleuze, when Foucault right before he dies starts talking about, you know, the anti-systemic nature of neoliberalism almost positively, are Deleuze inspiring both left and right accelerationism actually, because of capitalism's deterritorializing tendency in its crisis period, right?
Yeah.
Like, so I see that with Negri, but unlike the French, he doesn't ever formally say he's abandoning Marxism.
Yeah, even today with his weird stuff with Hart, he likes to make a lot of appeals to Marx, and probably still does to Lenin too. I don't know that as much, but I haven't read as much of Negri's like more recent stuff. I find it weird and harder to read, and he's already pretty hard to read in his early stuff. But I mean, because basically Negri lands in hot water after, in the hot, you know, autumn, there's a point where the Brigate Rossi, like the Red Brigades, which is like this small, you know, hyper-militant group, kidnaps the senator, holds him for ransom, and then kills him. Negri goes to prison and is tied to it. I think from what I can tell, it is kind of considered, you know,
he was more or less framed. His like,
yeah,
his relation to the Red Brigades is very thin.
It's a complicated thing of, in general, it is considered, yes, like they were cracking down on him as like this intellectual figure. Aldo Moro is the person that gets kidnapped and killed, who's the prime minister. And
weirdly, an Alex Jones associate was probably part of the people who had him killed. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a whole other side to this story which is involved, like, you know, Operation Gladio and shit, which you actually have to like go through like rigorously to figure out stuff because there's so much conspiracy theory around it. But I'm hoping to eventually get into that in my studies. It's still kind of I only have like loose fuzzy threads of it, but from my understanding, yes, like Negri is mostly just an excuse to put him in prison, though he doesn't help himself by having explicit calls to violence and he does have some ties to movements like this, like these little cells, like through his associations, and potentially some like loose connections to it. And also, I mean, like the thing about Negri is he's actually, his early work, he is actually like a very insightful person about certain developments, but also like his followers went and like kneecapped people that were like rivals to him in like his university and shit, like quite literally. So like he's also kind of a thug, like, and also it would be like embarrassing because he looks like a total dweeb. Like he's not intimidating at all, like looking at him. But
so anyway, he flees to France under the Mitterrand doctrine and starts hanging out with post-structuralists, and it all goes downhill from there. Bad
But
friend.
I was going to
No.
say, like, with the whole like capital as subject stuff in Marx Beyond Marx, which is his lectures on the Grundrisse, which happens in this period while he's at the University of France.
I find them both infuriating and insightful. So.
Yeah, they're infuriating and insightful, and he basically posits this weird, like, there's two subjects of capitalism. There's capital as subject and workers as subject, which is actually kind of consistent in a way with like workerist theory up to that point. Just they don't explicitly do that because they basically hold that like they don't go full Lukács in saying that like capitalism, like capital 1 through 3, is the Red Brigades are somewhat similar to the Red Army faction in certain ways, but like it wouldn't be entirely appropriate to say they're like the same.
No, for sure. The Red Army faction has more ties to like explicit Maoism and stuff than the Red Brigades do.
Yeah, I mean, 70s Italian politics is insane. You have like explicitly people calling themselves like fascist Maoists, and there's another organization called Prima Linea, like Front Line, and they're like way more explicitly terrorist than even the Red Brigades are. Like they were like scoffing at the Red Brigades. They're like, you're kidnapping people, you just kill them. Like that's all you should do is just like assassinate people left and right. But at this point, like the workerists from like start one, they haven't been fully Lukácsian. They clearly have read Lukács, but they don't take like the full like Marx's viewpoint is just the working class. They have this more, like dialectical view of like capital actually takes like the capitalist perspective first, breaks it down through the introduction of the worker as a subject in capital, which they see as like the thing that the capitalists, like to them, capitalist ideology is basically not thinking about the worker as anything. Or when they do think about the worker, they think of it as something that can be like smoothed over, as in Keynesianism, like through this idea of development that like papers over like the actual role of labor exploitation and the wage in that development and its relationship to crises. So they have this idea that like capital is the perspective of the worker insofar as capital is a book for workers to develop a scientific perspective, and that it also like involves their exploitation as a major factor of explaining what's going on. But they don't take it from the perspective of like everything in capital is like written out as the perspective of the worker. Like that workers like, that they don't take that kind of like viewpoint, and they don't take the idea that, again, like the idea of class composition is that like being a worker is actually quite contradictory and diffuse and rearranged in many different ways. But yeah, by this time, I don't know. I've read that Negri actually takes like the law of value very seriously through most of his earlier work on Keynesianism. I've read that by the time he does Empire with Hart, which is the main thing. He does
not.
That is the time that he, by the time that he's introduced to most English speaking in that work audiences in that work, he basically, again, like because he has this theory of like it's all becoming about control, he basically says capitalism through like digital technology and stuff has reached a point where it doesn't care about value anymore. It's just about direct control of like the population. It's not even about control like in terms of work anymore.
It's just about political control,
sense of control. Right. So yeah, the like law of value and stuff doesn't really matter to him anymore. And I wouldn't say
neither does really class either, because like that's when you get into like Empire and the Multitudes, because you basically, I mean, that book I read in high school because it was a #1 bestseller on left reading lists at a time when like, Trotsky and like Naomi Klein, early Naomi Klein, like No Logo, are the dominant, not Trotsky, Chomsky, are the dominant. Like there's hardly any, like even post-structuralist stuff is not like popular in the way that the Empire was. That book was on the New York Times bestseller list. Like that should strike you as weird. But what I found fascinating about it is not only does I find early Negri, even middle period Negri, because it's really what we're talking about. Like when I encounter him, like Marx Beyond Marx, or the Labor of Dionysus, even, which is like 1994. I find that at least comprehensible like communization is in terms of Marxist categories.
Yeah.
By the time you get to Empire and Multitude, I feel like I'm getting populism, global populism against global elites, phrased in a very obtuse way, so that you can't realize that it's basically just like outsider populism. The subaltern all rise together. We can, mass line, but not even as a workers. Like it's very, everybody against the center.
Yeah,
in a very obtuse way. But it made a lot of sense to people after the battle for Seattle and like the anti-globalization movement.
Right. Yeah, it's very tied to like anti-globalization stuff. And I think like one of the things about Operaismo is that the post-Operaismoists, even the ones that I think are much better than Negri, like one of the big things that they focus on is the idea that like they kind of say, because some of the smarter post-Operaismoists, when they've written like retrospectives and like contemporary developments, they say one of the advantages we had was that because we had this idea of recomposition of labor and reaction of state and capital to labor's like own form that leads to conflict inherently, is that we were able to see the kind of decline of the mass labor movement and think about it seriously. And that's true. Like a lot of the people that do work on this now are very interested in like precarious labor, labor that takes forms that looks like it's self-employed, but it's not. It's still entirely dependent on like big companies, people that work from home, people that do that kind of stuff, like commission laborers. And they tie this very seriously to like debt economies, advancements in technology, obviously. And some of it is pretty good, but even some of the better ones, they tend to do this thing where they like to make appeals to, they make the first appeal to Operaismo understood that the actual labor force is constantly being recomposed in new ways. They ignore the fact that this also was constantly implying that the labor force always just gets stronger and more revolutionary every time. Like that was what they thought, like that it would just always get stronger each time that capital like recomposed it because it would get socialized.
Oops.
Yeah, they just ignore that was like a huge part of it. Then they talk about like, because we have this interest in this, it is a useful research program for looking at like contemporary decomposed recompositions of labor that are not socialized. Then they like to say how radical and inspiring Operaismo was in the 60s and 70s and how militant it was, in order to basically cover up that most of their programs and solutions right now are quite boring. And I don't mean even boring in the sense that they're bad or wrong, but it usually appeals to things like, like I was reading one from like Sergio Bologna, who's like one of the big guys in this, like in Operaismo, like he's one of the OGs. And he does this, and then he just like, today there is the unemployment or the freelancers union in the US, and they help freelancers get insurance. And I was like, I've worked from home. I was like on the freelancer union newsletter. I've looked at like their insurance plans are not like revolutionary by any means. I was like, you can talk about how good it is that people are looking at this and like trying to make organizational structures for work that is not like socialized Fordist factory work, without talking about how you had terrorist cells in the 60s and 70s as your main like inspiring point. And in fact, there was
terrorist cells with an insurance plan, though.
Yeah. In fact, I remember watching this documentary that I found on YouTube. I don't remember what it was called, but it's basically about Negri. And it goes through like the Hot Autumn, and and it kind of glorifies it. It makes it sound like oh, it was like amazing. Students were going out with rifles and shit, and like when you actually read like some of the stuff that was going on, it is not as glamorous as they make it sound. But like it sounds.
Isn't that true for like most of the stuff from like 68, 69, 70, 71? Like you hear like, I mean, I remember thinking that like May 68 was all about the Civil War, and then I was like, there wasn't even a shot fired. Like,
well,
at all.
In Italy, it
Shots
was
were fired.
bad. Like it was. My point is like, it was radical, but I also think it was radical in ways that it was a lot of people not knowing what they were doing and how bad like violence could actually be. Especially because a lot of those radical cells that were engaged in violence were explicitly picking up like high school like age like people to like do stuff. But the documentary like makes it sound like like super inspiring and crazy, and then it gets to the point where it starts talking about like Negri's reemergence as a popular figure in the 90s, and it's showing like little cells of people in middle of nowhere going to convenience stores and like handing out $20 bills to people, and being like, the social wage will free us, like free money for people, and like and I'm like,
wow, that's like
why are you like connecting these two things as if it's fucking inspiring in some way? It's totally not.
It's weird for people who thought Keynesianism was a trap to basically get into that.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the other classic contradictions in Operaismo is because they hit on how complicated the need for kind of this anti-workerism, because they identify the wage as this like independent variable that is super important because you can make demands for the wage that totally blows up social reproduction if you can get it high enough. Like they start arguing for like social wage stuff, which basically sounds like an early kind of UBI thing.
Yeah, it sounds like UBI and maybe a little bit of like less wonkish MMT. Like,
but the idea for them is like more along the lines of like you should go out and petition for $1,000 a day.
Right.
like they actually are trying to make it that like you get the wage demand so high that it just explodes anything that the capitalists can possibly offer to like antagonize stuff.
I do like basically like social wage, social union militancy across sectors, and we're demanding insane things like I want $1,000 a day and a pony.
Yeah, like it's
and we're on general strike until we get it.
And it's one of the weaknesses in Operaismo in general is that they tend not to be super clear what they think that like the revolutionary break is, even though they become more and more convinced that there's going to be like this super definitive, in like insurrectionary, like there's a quote literally in one of Negri's like 70s writings where he says something like, we need to stop thinking the insurrection is the last step, it's the first step or something like that. But they're never really quite clear like what actually is going to happen, like what they think will like really occur. But I think it's also, again, like you have to take in the context of, at least with like Tronti, even though he's in this group of people that are acting outside of the official PCI, like, and I mean, again, also early Operaismo before it becomes Autonomia, like Autonomia is really the point where it becomes like militant cells that like call themselves groups and go and do things. Operaismo is really much more of a like collective research project, and it has people from the PCI, PSI, independent scholars. Like it's just a loose configuration of people doing research together, really. Like that's what it is. So you have to take into consideration that like part of Tronti's reason for going into the PCI again is that he's like, we still have like 20% of parliament and a huge union. Like the CGIL was not, regardless of its many like problems, especially, I mean, at this point they start being like, okay, we're not going to just do national bargaining. Like he had reason to think like we should be antagonizing for this institution to be more radical. Like, you know, that was part of the reason why they thought that these demands could be like important. And again, like, even though I'm trying to be cautious because they are over mythologized, there's actually a really good quote in this book I was reading by a woman who was a union activist, and who she basically went to the party. She worked in an electrical engineer factory where it was mostly women. There was a large population of it that was women, and they were struggling with, you know, basically too much, like overpaced, over outputted assembly line work and stuff. You know, people are getting health problems from doing the work. People are fainting. They can't, you know, take care of their home life and stuff. And the party union basically just did a standard petition for higher wages. And she went to the party office and was like, we need to be fighting for shorter hours, slower output, like tables, like we can't just ask for higher unions because you have higher wages because you have no idea what the actual conditions are and like what is harming people. And in her account, basically what the party people said is, you sound like those Quaderni Rossi people. You sound like the Red Notebooks people. Go away. And she was like, well, I left. I had no idea who these people were, but I wanted to go find out who they were because apparently they were talking about what these conditions were and our situation. So I think that it is like, again, like there was resonance here with things. And even though they were like talking about crazy higher wages, they were also interested in things like that like the idea of things just like health conditions as a strong period for slowing down work output and stuff was a significant part of their interest in work.
How does Tronti respond to Negri's later turn? Like that, you know, that'll be our final question for today. And of course, you'll be back to talk more about stuff Italian as you have read more. But and maybe we can figure out how this, you know, how even other kinds of dissident communisms in Italy responded to this. Somebody was like fascist Maoism. Whoa, and I'm like, Nazbo Maoism is like not even particularly hard to understand. They both talk about proletarian, like Mussolini loved talking about proletarian nations and stuff. So
the guy that proclaimed himself a fascist Maoist, you can find him on Wikipedia. I don't remember his name exactly, but I think he actually did like some major bombings or something, and he had like an actual little like, you know, terrorist cell. Like I said, the years of lead are legitimately insane in terms of like what people are doing and organizing. And
Italy doesn't play like the American days of rage are people bombing stuff and not killing anybody. That is not how it goes down in Italy.
It's
we have one question that you might be able to answer, and if you can't, we'll do research and answer it on one of your future appearances here on Varn Blog.
I'm not super familiar with this, or at least I don't recognize it from the Italian terminology. I don't know if that's a term for like what I mentioned with the southern workers who migrate north and are kind of, you know, and I think that's like Italian regionalism, especially at this point, like they are almost more racist. Like they basically have racism internal to like Italian, like Southern people. They're like, oh, you're like dark skinned and weird, and we don't like you, and you're like a hick, and you know.
I was trying to explain that to like
so I don't know if that's the right term or not.
The Liga del Norte is like basically saying Sicily is basically Africa, and stuff like that. Like they have weird internal racism. Another good question that does the Italian mafia get involved in less insurrection or militant unions or anything like that? They suppress them, unlike the
in Sicily, especially. There's a lot of shit that goes down with the mafia, but from what I know, they were mostly opposed to a lot of the leftist stuff that went on.
Yeah.
That's again not like, again, I mentioned briefly like the Operation Gladio is this weird mix of like US military support that's left over after World War II, NATO, like secret armament groups intervening in both left, like secretly propagating left-wing and right-wing militancy to try and like get them to attack one another and justify state intervention. The Pope's involved. The mafia's involved. Like, it's a mess.
Alex Jones associates are involved. Which is, I mean, seriously, it's part of why it has such a conspiracy theory cred, is there are people who were working for the U.S. government who have made hay out of their involvement in the conspiracy theory crowd itself. And so it's very hard to sort it all out.
Oh, okay. So Mason curses they were marginal figures that were supposed to merge with an increasingly impoverished student movement. I haven't encountered much about that, honestly, but I'll be interested in seeing if it comes up in more of the research I'm doing.
Do you know about Richard Drake? Because I don't know much about this guy. So
he's not been in any of my reading so far.
I'll put him on my list of my incredibly longer reading list of things to read, both historical and in actual.
Oh, he wrote. Okay, I do want to. He has a book called "The Revolutionary Mystique and Terrorism in Contemporary Italy," and I've been reading a fair amount of Alexander de Grand, who has this book, "The Italian Left in the 20th Century," that focuses on the general history of the PCI and PSI. He also has Italian Fascism, which is one of the standard, like if you just want a good rundown of like Italian fascism books. And he mentions that the work of Drake. I've wanted to get that book on terrorism in Italy, but I haven't gotten to it yet. One of the things I was going to say that I think is interesting is that even though they don't deal with it as directly as might be great, I think that workerism, even though at the earliest point it's talking about literally factory workers, it kind of points to how their idea of the worker is also political. Like, it involves the fact that people are organized and the class is recomposed in a way that is already political.
Right. So they understand the class in itself and the class for itself distinction that Marxists tend to go back and forth wildly, and other forms of Western Marxism, as to which one they think is important. And I think Operazo knows both are important and cannot be separated from each other.
Yeah. And I think that it is one of the reasons why its relationship to things like the student movement and the feminist movement, like these were also just like autonomously like powerful movements that were emerging because of like real social just conditions. Like, it wasn't Operaismo inspired them or something. And I think that the more that I just read about workers' movements in general, the more I think it's important to realize how complex it is trying to think about its relationship to other movements. Even though I remain skeptical of like populist solutions that are just like, aren't they all just the same, fighting against the big enemy that is vague and we'll all just get along. Like, I think that it does reveal something about like relating things back to the capitalist framework and trying to like understand the political identity of work is part of what lets them relate to other social movements without just being populist in a way. Bippo is an autonomist. I believe he's involved in what is called Radio Alice in the 70s, which is like this weird independent pirate radio kind of project that has a bunch of weird stuff. I don't know a whole lot about him otherwise, because most of the stuff you can get by him in English is post-operatismo stuff that is not that impressive.
Yeah, I was going to say, a lot of it's like quasi-anarchist stuff, a little bit of post-structuralism, a little bit of Paul Virillo, a lot of like Bifo's kind of all over the place. When I've read his English stuff that's published by Verso and whatever.
He does have a relationship to like some of the Negri strains in like the 70s and things. I will say, interesting thing. I can go through some of the books I have. I literally pre-ordered tomorrow the Italian list, which is like a line of books in translation out of Seagull Books, which I think is also through University of Chicago. They're releasing a book called The Golden Horde, which is by Nanni Bellistrani, who is most well known for his novels. He wrote like We Want It All and stuff, which is basically about like an account of the like 70s movements and stuff. And it's basically a big old collection of essays and commentaries and things on like the popular culture of the time, from the 60s through the 70s. It has Sergio Bologna, Umberto Eco, Tony Negri, Panzieri, Rossana Rossanda. Like it has a ton of Italian figures in it. So it's literally becoming available for order tomorrow. People might want to check it out. It's expensive though. It's like $40. Some other stuff I already mentioned, Degrand. I think it's always good to read stuff on the labor movement in general and the political situation in general before just going to autonomism, because otherwise you won't know what they're responding to.
Yeah, what the context are. I find that people reading theory out of context is destructive a lot of the time.
So again, I mentioned Alexander de Grand's Italian Left in the 20th century. It basically just goes like, this is the Communist Party and the Socialist Party from their foundation up to whenever it was published. I don't remember. It's not like the most riveting read, but it's presented very clearly. One thing that makes it's easier to read in part because he doesn't drop a lot of references, but that's infuriating to me as a researcher. He does the bibliographic essay at the end, and I'm like, no, I want to know this. I want to know what you're citing when you put the statistic in. Another book that I've been reading that I love so far is Visions of Emancipation, the Italian workers' movement since 1945. Like in the first 10 pages, it explains like the union structure of Italy, like from 1945 up through like the 80s, which is when it was published. It goes through just like a lot of great information on, just statistics, wage levels, who was involved in what the party policies and thinking was. And it's actually like very easy to read. So it's super useful for context of just like what the workers were doing before you even take into consideration what the autonomists are thinking about as like a small sect of theorists. The other ones, States of Emergency, Cultures of Revolt from 1968 to 1978. You can get through Verso. It's actually been around for a long time. I don't see it referenced a lot. It's pretty good. It's more of a cultural history, but it goes into like it goes more into like the student movements, the feminist movements, the social movements from which the 60s and 70s periods of revolt like emerged, and what the social conditions were like and how people were reacting to it. It's got like a lot of fun little like the political cartoons and stuff from the time. So it's a useful companion for that. I found it. And it goes into the mythologizing of violence from this period too, which is definitely like a very useful kind of thing to have. And then the classic one in terms of history is probably Storming Heaven by Steve Wright. The main thing to be cautious with this one is Steve Wright basically promotes autonomous Marxism in the tradition of Harry Cleaver. So it does play into some of the mythologizing, I think. but it does have actually, I think, a not undecent kind of balance sheet of the pros and cons. And the postscript, it has a postscript. If you get the second edition, it comes with an afterword by a couple of guys, Riccardo Bellafiore and Massimiliano Tomba, who were both, I believe, involved in workerism. And the afterword is, I think, just like almost worth the price of admission, because it's them talking about the book in reference to their own experiences of Vaporismo and what they think the insufficiencies of it were. And it's got some great Tony Negri bashing in it. Like, they really lay into just like the problems, and especially they lay into the idea that class recomposition always just means that the class gets more socialized and more radical, and also how that plays into not being able to deal with what that means in the face of the working class not appearing very unified as workers in any political sense. They really go into a good breakdown of like that problem. So it's a pretty good book. For Tronti, you could get Workers and Capital, full book in English. It's from Verso. David Broder is a good guy. I've interviewed him before.
I'm gonna say I've argued with him on the internet. He's a good guy, though, actually, sincerely.
Yeah, I will say Jacobin's stuff on Italy tends to be better than their stuff on the U.S. And from what I've seen.
Yeah, I have noticed actually that their stuff on it tends to be better than their stuff on Latin America too, frankly. But
and he also, David Broder has an article that's on Catalyst about Operaismo and what he thinks the insufficiencies of the focus on militancy is, without looking at like the actual like party and political relations that it was responding to. And it's one of the articles that Catalyst has online for free. So if you just look up like David Broder Catalyst, you should be able to read it. He also got me my copy of the Bordiga book for free, which saved me a couple $100. So
what to say, that Bordiga book is I don't
until
have
they
it
get
yet.
The Haymarket version, yeah,
which is still going to be like $50, but
if you want to read more Negri, more Tronti, Viewpoint magazine has also translated some of his stuff.
There's a couple of good books on Tronti too. I have another one. Hold on. Viewpoint's translated stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, they've translated his like really early stuff, which is mainly talking about Della Volpe and his critiques of Gramsci, or specifically the Togliatti like PCI officialized version of Gramsci.
The Weapon of Organization.
That's that one I haven't read yet. That's like a collection of lectures, essays, and stuff. One of the things about Tronti is I don't know a whole lot about what he actually did in his position as senator and what he holds for. I know that recently he's kind of shit.
Yeah, he apparently was unseated in 2018.
Yeah,
but
he was supporting. There's some guy that's like now in charge in Italy and basically ran on a whole, like overcoming left and right by just appeals to kind of like populism of like, we will find the issues that matter to people,
like Podemos and whatnot, like that
almost
sort of thing.
But it was one of the, and like Tronti wrote this thing about like using theory, like he just name dropped a ton of like theory to talk about, like how this was a great opportunity and stuff, and it was just like, oh come on, dude, like it's actually some of the stuff Broder has written on Jacobin most recently is about this guy that recently gained political power, and it's the government now under Mario Draghi. It's kind of embarrassing. But with your final question, honestly, I don't know that Tronti has ever really responded to Negri that much in his later writing. He definitely develops, he doubles down on the PCI. He remains involved in politics his whole lifetime. And he develops an idea of the autonomy of the political. I haven't gotten into that as much.
And it seems like his autonomy of the political would be straight in the face of Negri's like real subsumption as applied to the political sphere.
Yeah, and it's almost. I know that some people have related that part of Tronti's autonomy of the political reads a little bit like some Althusserian stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And there is like a very slight like ships passing in the night situation with them. But like the connection to Della Volpe and Coletti are also people who read against Hegelian Marxism and read Capital as this like definitive like attack on Hegelianism. Frankly, I think they do it in a way that's more interesting than Althusser.
Della Volpe is way more, to me, interesting as a figure, particularly because, I mean, similar to actually Althusser, because Althusser started off as a Hegelian too, but like particularly Della Volpe's like initial philosophy comes straight out of Giovanni Gentile, like, the Hegelian philosopher of fascism, and he reacts against that into Gramsciism, and then reacts against Gramsciism into like something that leads Tronti into things like Apparismo. I just know that as a vague outline, and I've known about Volpe for a long time because of my fascination with all the crazy generativeness that was the Italian 19 teens and then the Italian 1970s, and like that weird like so many of the world's political ideas have come out of that. But
I do think it's very funny that Althusser like references Della Volpe and Coletti in part because like Coletti actually writes like the preface to like a lot of the collections of the early young Marx, like when that comes out. But he somehow thinks that they are like Gramscians, and I'm like, dude, you have no idea what they're doing here then. Like,
right.
Like, I don't know if it's just because he sees they're in the PCI and Della Volpe like is always like loyal to the Togliattian party, even though he's critiquing them. Coletti eventually gets disenfranchised when he comes out like neocon. But I'm just like Althusser's like, these guys are Gramscians. And I'm like, what? No, that's the entire point of what they're doing. Is like trying to oppose that. But yeah, it's a weird, convoluted history of relationships.
Yeah, particularly once Team France gets involved. Just gonna say,
yeah,
my anti-francophone bias comes out yet again, except for our boy, Bourdieu, which I'm sure, and I don't always hate Badu. But
yeah, Badu he's at least kind of fun.
He's a crazy red Platonist, but he's at least fun.
Yeah.
And occasionally says insightful things. I think sometimes just out of boredom or something. But in general, Team France and Team Italy, when they get together, that's how fascism was born. Just saying. So like
Sorel. Yeah.
You got to be careful when those two things, when France and Italy get together. It's like when the US and the UK get together or something. It's just not good. So on that note, we'll end here. I thought thank you for your time. I learned a lot, and I know a lot about Italian communism, and so. In fact, I've been reading Tronti kind of just to get a feel for it. And I definitely was reading, the workers' book, as I like to call it. And it felt so different from the late Negri that I read like in college that I was like, what? Like even Marx Beyond Marx didn't read like this. So I found it very interesting and helpful, but also somewhat limiting. And what I find interesting is basically it would make sense that Viewpoint would pick it up, right? Because Viewpoint and labor notes and all that do come out of that same workers' inquiry tradition.
Yeah. It's Viewpoint magazine has some good stuff. They also have translations from another guy called Romano Alquati, who he was kind of the main workers' inquiry guy for a long time. Like he was doing a lot of stuff in Fiat and the Olivetti factories, and he kind of prefigured like the idea of like class composition instead of class consciousness. So it's good to read those two. But yeah, Viewpoint, I'm always actually kind of impressed with their output, but I'm also like confused.
I'm impressed with it too, but I'm like, so you're Althusserian anarcho-workerist.
Yeah, they're
okay.
They're a little too over theorized sometimes for my taste.
I remember reading Assad Hatter's book on identity and like his pleas for universalism, and I was like, well, why are you using Foucault to get to this? Like, there are easier ways to get your point across. But yeah. Just so you guys know, PH and I work together on a lot of stuff increasingly. PH has me on Radical Thoughts as a specialist on the weird people he can't find other specialists for.
Yeah.
And I'm not always actually a specialist. I've just read a lot of shit, particularly on the Radical Thought stuff. I read that in college. It was all the rage when I was in grad school. Let's see. But you also work with me on Former People, where we don't talk about politics, at least not directly.
Yeah. Talk about art and shit.
Yeah, we've recorded 2 episodes. They'll eventually come out. Yeah. I'm trying to make sure we have enough that if I have to go on break for, I don't know, 6 months, or like our third person who's vital to our enterprise, Shallon, has to, I don't know, defend her dissertation or write it or something, that we can just keep the flow going even when we're not recording. So that's why we're holding off releasing them. We're not hoarding them. So you guys will get more PH. PH will probably be a semi-regular here on Varn blog, since we are talking about my next book project, because I don't write books by myself unless they're poetry. I'm be one of those people. Will probably be with PH on these issues and applying them to contemporary society, just like the book I'm writing with Shallon Buntine on Lash, misinterpretations of Lash, the limits of Lash, and applying it to the contemporary left. And I actually was fascinated because how much this stuff rhymes, and I never thought it would. I would not think that the Italian stuff would rhyme at all with what Lash was writing about in the United States, but it actually kind of does. So it's good stuff. And with that note, I'm going to let you guys go. PH, hang out for a second with me in the room. Bye. You guys don't know what we're talking about.